Yesterday, I gave you my fake NBA award ballot. Now, for more fakeness, it's the Fantasy Awards for the NBA season. Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and fruit salad is indeed yummy, yummy. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Thank you for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We are available on all platforms. Double bang, hit the thumb. All of that stuff. It's a great way of helping the show, helping you be a part of growing everything. Leave your comments. All that stuff is awesome. A couple of things that people have mentioned. Yes, this is a new camera that I've got set up here, so that's why things look a little bit different. Still working on tweaking some of my setups and how it all looks, everything, but we're going to be experimenting with that sort of stuff through the off-season. That's what we're here for. Yesterday, we did the fantasy or the NBA awards. I went through and gave all my picks. Today is the fantasy awards. I don't think it's going to be as long of a show. I'm not going to be going into every single bust and sleeper and hit and miss, that sort of stuff. There will be a separate show that I do for that next week, looking back at the things that we looked at, got right, got wrong, why we got it right, why we got it wrong, what we can learn from, all of that sort of stuff. We're going to do a separate show on the value of rankings, how to interpret them, what they mean, how you should use them, all of that sort of stuff as well. Then individual season review stuff where we dig into more players in more detail and discuss this stuff, which is always just a good baseline. Helps me a lot. Hopefully it helps you, just little bits of information seeping through and just, hopefully some fun. Also, probably later today, I think it'll come out, we will do the full playoff first round preview / predictions. I won't have the results of the second play-in game for that. I can't wait for that because I am actually heading overseas for a wedding tomorrow. So we will we'll know who's knocked out by the time I record that, and we will know who is in the final play-in game. And then I will just do my first round previews based on what I know from there. So that'll come out later today. After that, second Eastern the absolute barn burner between the Hawks and the Bulls, although I could pretty much just tell you that whoever wins that game is going to lose to whoever loses the other game. That's my prediction on that, but that's what we'll do later on today. So what we are here to do today, as I said, is talk fantasy awards. We're here to look at the best producers in fantasy, not real life, not rookie of the year. I'm not even going to give you a fantasy rookie of the year because you know who it is. I'm not even there's no point in that. We're not going to do an expansive show with 25 award categories or anything like that. We're going to go through the basics. Fantasy MVP. We're going to look at Waiver Wire Steal. We're going to look at the Bust of the Year. And we're going to look at the Breakout Player of the Year. I think that covers a lot of stuff. And there's a fair bit of robust discussion that we can have with that. But let's start at the top. Let's talk about the Fantasy MVP. I won't say it's a problem, but part of the situation that happens in fantasy is there's so many different ways to evaluate players. Do you look at per game numbers? Do you look at 9-cat? Do you look at 8-cat? Do you look at rotisserie style numbers? Do you look at things that are more suited to head with a -1, taking punting into consideration? Do you take into consideration weighting? Do we talk about Yahoo points formats, ESPN points formats? Do we talk about custom points formats? I tried to start something, did a lot of research last preseason using a new ranking system called Durant, which I'm going to do I'm not going to cover Durant in this show. I'm going to do something on that in the off season. There's definitely going to be some tweaks made to it. Particularly around the percentages. The other stuff I'm pretty comfortable with. I think all of the other categories are good. The percentages where I need to do a little bit of tweaking on that formula, but we'll talk about the results of that later on as well. And then there's the whole discussion. Do you look at per game numbers? Do you look at total numbers? How much does that matter? What is the purpose of looking back on this sort of stuff now as well? When we talk about looking back at the last season, it's all well and good to say, well, this guy was great. He played 80 games and he was this level player in totals, but what does it mean for us when we look forward to next season? That's the thing that I'm always wanting. That's great. Like we got this information, but what does it mean? What does it tell us? Where do we go from there? I can't sit here and go, well, you know what, it was actually awesome. I picked this guy back in 2020 and he was the 5th best guy on totals. That's cool, but now he plays 10 minutes a night, or he's Hassan Whiteside, he doesn't play at all. Doesn't tell you anything. Right? There's no value in that sort of stuff, I don't think. Can it give you a slight snapshot of what happened? Sure. But there's also limitations in all of that as well. Because there's limitations of, if a guy's is the value of it, where's the cutoff come from? Because a totals guy is great, unless it's 82 games of Obi Toppin. You go, what's the point of that? That's not useful for me, even though that will push him 100 spots ahead of a bunch of other guys. Whereas someone who's way worse in totals but better in per game numbers will sit there and be great, but then you can drop him if he gets hurt or cools off and you add the next guy in. The next guy in. It's a rotating roster spot. So where's the cutoffs? Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. We're talking fantasy MVP. So let's talk about it. I think it's okay. This is so weird that we do this because it's just the same stuff. It's the same player every year. Now, you'll notice that there are 2 names repeated on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. I've got different setups here as well to look at it. We're talking categories here first. If I just use straight 9 category rankings, no weightings, turnovers included, all that sort of stuff, which is not a way that I suggest looking at that will tell you that Robert Williams was ranked higher than Luka Doncic 2 years ago. That will tell you that DeLon Wright was a better player than Giannis Antetokounmpo last season. That will tell you a lot of things that are completely false and inaccurate and don't reflect how the game is played, right? All that in mind. This season, the top player, and the 2 lines there, regular and italicized, the top number player there is the best per game producer in fantasy, straight 9 cat numbers. It is Joel Embiid. He was miles ahead of everybody. The next one is who was the best player for totals numbers using straight 9 cat numbers, and it's Nikola Jokic. Jokic played 79 games this season. And obviously playing 79 games is huge. That's missing him. I think he missed 12 or 13 games last season. So playing 79 from Jokic this season is huge. He was obviously banged up as well. He was dealing with some wrist problems and hip problems and all that sort of stuff. But that's just a massive performance. So if you're using your straight 9-cat values, straight 9-cat rankings, your per game winner was Joel Embiid by a pretty, a decent enough margin. He was number 1 in per game. Shea was number 2, and Jokic was number 3 for straight 9-cat per game MVP numbers. Okay? But then we know that Embiid played, 39 games? Which is very clearly not enough to be that good for you. You had him as your first round pick. He wasn't there in your playoffs and didn't give you anything. So it was Embiid, Shea, and Jokic for per game value. For total value, it was Jokic, Shea, and Davis. Anthony Davis in totals in 9-cat. It's number 3. Yeah. The next one is total. So you got Nikola Jokic there. The next one, with the one in the middle here, is the rankings that I use and refer to all the time. It's a weighting system and a projection system and a ranking system that I have used for many, many years and I think gives really good results. It involves in it, because again, we're talking the majority of category leagues, 85% of category leagues are head-to-head. 65%, I think, of all leagues are category leagues. 35% are points leagues. 5% overall are roto leagues. Yeah, that's how the breakdown usually is. So when we're talking the majority of category leagues, the vast majority being head-to-head leagues, I don't think that a straight 9-cat ranking really helps you. Because again, that would tell you that Giannis was unrosterable last season. 130th best player, Paolo 230th, which is just clearly false. Just is clearly not right. So I've weighted things to account for the low volume nature of certain stats. I've weighted things in terms of the head-to-head game is basically a streaming game. A lot of it, and we've talked a lot 2 days ago about why I don't necessarily like that, but that's how it is. And that, so when you're streaming, that turnovers are just naturally going to be high, and then the correlate, all that sort of stuff. I've gone over this a million times. But then weighting down the lower volume stats, because if you keep those lower volume stats with this high value, you get these guys who are strong in one category, jumping way up the rankings, and then those categories are the most volatile because you can't get 0.7 steals. You can either get 1 or 0, or 2 or 1. And that game-to-game, week-to-week stuff is highly variant, highly variable, and it doesn't give you a good reflection. So that's my original weighting measures. I say all this to tell you that the results are the same. your per game MVP was Joel Embiid, and your totals MVP was Nikola Jokic. The bottom one is something that I am trying, and I sort of touched on this in the preseason / last offseason about the way that we view percentages with standard rankings, with Z-scores. They get wildly out of whack, massively out of whack. Because usually with your Z-scores, you'll get like the highest player in a category being like a 3. Part of where my Durant thing came in where I didn't love how that worked, but it was a 3. Yeah, and then your minus category would be like a minus 1.9 or whatever as the worst player in that category. 0 is the 75th best player out of a 150 player sample. That's your 0 in Z-scores. But percentages, because of the way that they are and the way that we're including 2 variables, makes and misses, to get percentage and volume together, you get players like Giannis having a -6 in free throw percentage, or players getting a -4 in field goal percentage or whatever. And I did a lot of number-based calculations on this last offseason to show that when you actually just break it down on a week-by-week basis, that's like it is actually easy enough to win with Giannis on your team in free throws. You can do this. It's not like, well, I just have to remove this. It's but that ranking will tell you again that Giannis was undraftable in category leagues last season, like 130th or whatever he was, which is clearly not true. So I want to experiment with a different weighting where I just weight percentages in half. So instead of Giannis's free throws being a -5.7, he's a -2.6 or whatever it is, whatever the number is. -5.2 to 2.6. Which I think gives a better indication that these percentages can be highly variable. But the negative impact that we have ascribed to it is probably not as big as those numbers originally tell us. And again, that's just me again giving you a heads up that I'm going to be doing this and talking about this sort of adjusted weighting, the percentage weighting is what I'm going to call it, when we talk stuff through the offseason and preseason as a slight tweak to my overall metric. But it's still the same blokes that won. It was Embiid at 1, Embiid for per game, and it was Jokic for totals. But just that's more just an introduction, me telling you that that's how we're going to be approaching that. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. It is. I'm competitive, right? I want to be the best there ever was, like no one ever has. That's not even how those words go, but it's close enough. But I just want to win. And with Monopoly Go, yeah, I can do it. And I want to win. And I'm going to win. So if you want to play something competitive, you don't know what Monopoly is like. You know the game. Well, this is a great twist on the classic Monopoly. You can play on not one, but hundreds of different Monopoly boards in crazy locations. Build up these amazing cities and bring in big money. And you can go ahead and mess with your friends. You charge them rent on those iconic properties like you do in classic Monopoly. You heist value from their riches, taking it from them. You go in there and look at the leaderboard to see who is, in the end, the biggest Monopoly tycoon. You can team up with friends as well to enter competitions and timed tournaments to get huge rewards around the world. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store or on Google Play. Okay. That was your fantasy MVP for categories. There was a lot of discussion there, which I don't really need to continue to do. So let's go back now and look at the fantasy points MVPs using ESPN standard scoring and Yahoo standard scoring. And it's a similar story, not 100% the same, but your fantasy points per game MVP for both Yahoo and for ESPN was Luka Doncic. There's a lot of misunderstanding about some of the things that I say, and people will catch a little glimpse of thing or misremember what I said. But when I talked about Luka Doncic being a bust, I was very, very clear to talk with Luka Doncic that in points leagues, I still wouldn't take him I wouldn't let him drop outside the top 3. In category leagues, I wouldn't take him inside the top 4. He'd go around 5 or 6 for me. And the reason was that if you were playing in that format that I set up with the playoffs, is that in the finals week, you got 2 games out of him. And if there's someone that's relatively similar, well, you take the bloke who's going to play 4 games most likely in your finals or 3 games in your finals. That was the rationale. Luka could not do more than play 2 games in that final week. That didn't mean that you don't draft him. That doesn't mean that in a points league you let him go past 3. It means that you take him, but understand that if there are other guys that are real close, that 2-week week is a killer. And I think he was like 50th in category leagues in that 2-game week. And in points leagues, I think he was 37th. Which, again, is not what you want from the guy you pick at number 1. You just don't. There'll be variance, but maybe you want him 10th or 7th or something. You don't want him 50th. So that's when I said, I wouldn't draft Luka top 3 or 4. Also in category leagues, he'd never been anywhere near that good. He still didn't finish number 1, but in points leagues, he had been number 1 and number 2 for many years. It was just that 2-game week skewed it down. Anyway, Luka was your per-game fantasy points MVP for both Yahoo formats and ESPN formats. But he wasn't in totals. That was Jokic, who played the 79 games to Luka's 70. 9 games difference makes a big deal. Again, there are problems with looking at totals as a general rule with overvaluing or undervaluing people's production, understanding that injuries and games played are not a correlatable stat year on year. They're just not. We will prove it again. Maybe we won't because I haven't looked at the numbers. But every year, so the last 2-3 years that I've done this, the correlation has told us that there is weak to no correlation of games played year on year, meaning that what they did the year before doesn't mean what they do the next year. So we can't look at this and go, I've got to consider it. Luka will play 9 less games than Jokic next season. Maybe, maybe not. Don't know. But that's how it worked out this season. Luka was number 1 per game, and Jokic was number 1 in totals across points leagues. And I don't think that's going to be too much of a surprise there. What about the best waiver wire pickup? The guy that you were able to snag on waiver wires in a lot of different scenarios. Now, I use some different classifications here. Yahoo has this nice little feature where it gives you the preseason ADP of a player. It gives you their whole ADP, which you've got to be careful because for some reason they do drafts up until Christmas, so that you see the guys that break out end up having your 50-spot jumps in their ADP. So we use the preseason ADP. But what I also like to do is what percentage of leagues were these guys drafted in? So in terms of being a guy that was a waiver wire steal, and some of these names you look at and go, well, he was drafted in my league, and that's true. But the player pool that I looked at here was somebody who was drafted in less than 50% of leagues, and I think that's a fair way of looking at it. So they were available on the waiver wire in over half of leagues when the season started. And the winner, you're not going to be surprised. The winner is Jalen Johnson. We look at this on a category and points league that's the same player both times for categories and points. Jalen was someone that as soon as John Collins was traded, I was like, all right, let's go. Jalen Johnson is the guy that I like. I think he's going to be a really good player. I hope they use him. And then someone rightfully pointed out, no, they'll just play Sadiq Bey. And I went, oh my God, I completely forgot that they have Sadiq Bey, who I think is bad. And I've always thought he's bad. And you've heard me say that I think he is bad. But then you try and get into Quinn Snyder's head and you go, well, Snyder he's always wanted shooting at the 4. That's why he played Bojan Bogdanovic at the 4 in Utah. That's the style he's gone for. So I think they'll probably will give Bey the opportunity, even though Johnson's clearly better for their future and a clear better player in my mind. I think they will go with Bey early on, and they did. Bey started the first game of the season, and then it took one game and they went, oh no. Jalen Johnson has to be this guy, and he took over and he went crazy from there. So I was massively in on taking him in the last couple of rounds as that flyer type player. I really liked taking Jalen Johnson. In the end, I was nowhere near high enough on him. I should have been way higher on him because I was going against my valuation of how I think the player can develop versus what the coach will do with that spot. And then how does the Hunter, Bey, Johnson minutes all sort of shake out. But we did target Jalen a lot. We had him, I think, on a thumbnail of a sleeper show, and he was the best waiver wire pickup. His ADP preseason for Yahoo was 145, and he was drafted under 50% of leagues. A very, very small amount of leagues for Jalen Johnson in terms of how many he was picked in. If I just go and have a look at that, actually, tell you exactly what the percentage was. He was drafted in 22% of leagues. That is a wild number. That number next to him there, the 145 is his ADP. He ended up using -1 per game ranks as 55th. The second name there, the italicized name, is his teammate, Bogdan Bogdanovic, who is the waiver wire steal based on totals. He had an ADP, Bogdanovic, of 141, which is obviously not very high. Now, he was also another guy that I was like, I think when we're looking for some scoring and assists late, like, he's got a role. I'm okay with drafting. I didn't think he had super, super high upside. Honestly, I was okay with drafting. I wasn't massively on him, but he did end up on some of my teams. But for totals in category leagues, 38th. He was drafted in 46% of leagues. He had an ADP of 141, and he ended up 38th on totals, -1 category ranks. He had a lot of steals. That is a great example of when you look at category league and total rankings where Bogdanovic was a top 40 player. That means absolutely nothing when we move forward. Like, it doesn't mean a single thing. Like, there is no way we look at this and go, yeah, Bogdanovic was 38, Jalen Johnson was behind him, so we'd take Bogdanovic higher next season. Nobody thinks that. Nobody does that. Doesn't mean anything. And I would say most of you would also say that Jalen Johnson was a significantly better player this season than Bogdanovic. But that's how the numbers shake out. For points leagues, it's actually the same. The same guys. For per game, Jalen Johnson, who unbelievably finished 55th per game Yahoo points and 55th in -1 category ranks. And then Bogdanovic was 38th in categories in totals and 65th in points leagues in totals. So he was your waiver wire steal of the year. Both Hawks guys, weirdly enough. Jalen Johnson for per game. Bogdanovic for totals. For totals, yeah. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It is playoff time in the NBA, as you know. The NHL playoffs are coming up. They might have started, I'm not sure. Baseball is in full swing, second month of the season there. FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That is $150, win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots, home runs, slam dunks. Don't think you can bet on technical fouls, but whatever. It's all on an app that is safe. We all love free throws. That's our best thing. All on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win, because that's what you do. You get 150 in bonus bets back. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and don't forget to gamble responsibly. Also, don't forget to not gamble on games if you're an NBA player, or bet your own unders or bet against your team to lose. Probably not a good idea. Jonte Porter, who's banned for life from the NBA, good, get that garbage out of here. The man was clearly having some very big gambling problems. Just absolute idiocy. What an absolute clown. All right. So the waiver wire steal. This is the one that I'm sure you're all here for. I was going to say this is the one I'm sure you're all coming for. I don't think this would make you come. But maybe you did click on this to hear about the bust of the year. Who was it? There are a number of candidates for this. And this was a tough one for me to figure out. And you say it's not that hard, Josh, it's easy. This is why I found it a hard one to figure out. Is because I've been trying to say this all year. What is the guy that you take in round 4 becomes a 10th round player? Right? How bad is that? It's bad. The guy you take in round 2 becomes a 8th round player. That's still 6 rounds of slide. But the round 2 to round 8 one is worse because you invested a higher pick. So what if it's a round 2 guy that slides to being a round 6 player? That's a 4-round slide versus a 4 to 10, which is a 6-round slide. Who's the bigger bust? So I tried to weight this based on my original opening night projected values, not even the ordinal rank number, the actual standard deviation ranking formula number that I've got, because we know that it's not equal, that number 1, the difference between number 1 and number 10 is the same as between 11 and 70, so it's not like about individual numbers. I use that ranking value number to get where the value is and then where they ended up end of season, and with some weighting based on initial ranking as to how high I had them projected, not even based on ADP necessarily, to try and work out who the biggest actual busts and costs you the most players were. That's for categories. For points leagues, it was just where did their points fall, but also weighing in on the original projected points. Yeah, so higher picks hurt more. I am not, for bust of the year, I am not including injured players. I'm just not. Because obviously we know that taking Joel Embiid or LaMelo Ball, who played under 40 games and Ball under 30 games, in the first round and didn't play from January, after January, that's a massive bust. That's your best player gone for a big portion of the season, because Embiid obviously was number 1 per game. Ball was like a 10th per game, like bang on his per game number, or around that mark, but they didn't play. And you can't, like, you might say that you can, but you can't predict injuries. You can't. So I'm not including those guys. This is on per game numbers, guys that played who stunk. So do you think this is me setting you up to tell you that actually Jordan Poole wasn't the bust of the year? That I've been absolved of my sins? That I actually was correct with Jordan Poole? Do you think that's accurate? Because it's not. Because Jordan Poole is the bust of the year, and he stunk. You've heard me talk about it again, but let's just say it. No, not one last time. Let's say second last time. My thought was that Jordan Poole had a big usage, playing 30 minutes a night with good free throws on high volume, solid assists, good scoring, good threes on a Warriors team where he came off the bench. And going to a new team, he would A, play more minutes, B, have more or all the same usage, C, be able to run the offense more, and really start, even though he will be bad in field goals, he will start to just lift those numbers up. Of course he didn't. His usage went down somehow. His minutes went down somehow. He was unbelievably disinterested. He looked like a fool most of the time. Until we got to the end of the season where he was good again. And, that also leads into the situation where this guy was a bust, but then returned top 50 value through the final 5 weeks of the season. Is it a bust? It is. Because, like, if you took Jordan Poole the end of round 3, start of round 4, does that preclude you from making the playoffs? I don't think so. But in a lot of cases, it might have. So him having that value at the end of the season doesn't mean anything. And I think a lot of you would have dropped him, and rightfully so, because he was like sitting at 120, 130 for weeks, and it just didn't look like changing. And then it did. Also, part of the reason that I was in on Poole is I thought they would move on from Tyus Jones and they would end up starting Jordan Poole at point guard, which would help a lot. And then Tyus Jones got a back injury, and Jordan Poole started at point guard, and everything went through the roof. So, again, that analysis part of it was sort of correct, but also wildly wrong, because he didn't play more minutes, he didn't get more usage, he didn't do any of those things. He just sucked, and I know he sucks. I just thought that on a sucky, bad team, you get players who are bad, Kelly Oubre, putting up big numbers. But it just didn't happen. So he is your bust of the year. Jordan Poole had an ADP of 48. He ended up with -1 per game numbers at 94th. So he did end up sneaking inside the top 100, amazingly, for the year. And that hurts. I've given you the top 4 names here. Those top 4 names on that list are for categories. The bottom italicized names are points. The next 2, again, you'll say that's not really that bad, Josh, but Steph Curry and Tyrese Halliburton ended up as having significant negative impacts on you. Because Steph had an ADP of 7. Tyrese Halliburton had an ADP of 7. I actually had them projected on my per game -1 stuff at like 5 and 6, I think it was. 5 Halliburton, 6 Curry, or 4 and 6, or whatever it was. So slightly ahead of ADP. But Curry ended up 17th per game. Halliburton ended up 15th per game. And Halliburton was like 30th for the final 2-3 months of the season. And having your top 5, top 6 pick, so let's say look, the ADP was like 6.8. So let's say top 6 pick, Steph or Halliburton, be a middle second round player, is pretty significant. It's a gigantic drop in that overall projected value, even though the ranking number falls back. And again, that's where we look at it and think that, well, Josh, that's not that. It's first to second round. It's not that much of a fall. But the gap between first and second round is the same as the gap between second round and 7th round. So if your second rounder became your 7th round player, or your 4th round player became your 8th round player, Jordan Poole style, well, that's a similar drop going from middle first to middle second round in actual statistical value. So that's why Curry and Halliburton are there. And again, you will say that's ridiculous, Josh, because again, they finished as second round players and they were first round. But if you just remove the ordinality of 1 is to 2 is to 3 is to 4, the gap there is massive. It's significant. It's huge, to use the same word 3 different times. It's big. Giggity. The next one, the 4th one, was Jaren Jackson, who had an ADP of 20. He ended up with a -1 per game rank of 47th. He ended up playing 65 right on the nose. I wish I could remember the name of that law that when you institute a artificial benchmark, then that then becomes the target and you can't ever sort of push past it. Goodhart's law, maybe? I'm completely butchering that. I need to look it up now. Yeah, Goodhart's law it is. It says when a measure becomes a target, 65 games, then it ceases to be a good measure. And I don't know that this is true, but he definitely played exactly 65 games, Jaren Jackson, to be eligible for an all-defensive team. Now, there is a chance that without that limit there, maybe he played fewer games. Unlikely. But there's also the possibility that he saw all the other all-defensive guys playing 72 games and go, well, actually, if I want to make this team, I've got to actually keep pushing. I don't know whether that's true or not, but what it ended up meaning is that this measure of that's enough games, if you set it as a target, then it stops being a measure of that's enough games. I have my criticisms of that, as you're well aware. But Jaren was... initial Yahoo rankings had Jaren at 9. Then he pushed to 12 and 13, and then, I talk and things get adjusted a lot. In the end, his ADP ended up at 20, which I think I had him at 26 or 27. When you look at those numbers and, you can end up drafting someone at 21 or 22, depending on need and how the draft is shaken out. Because again, this is not like the 22nd player is always ahead of 23 and always ahead of 24 and always ahead of 25. That's not how any of it works. But Jaren still was a big disappointment. Taking this guy at the middle to end of the second round, him getting towards the 50s in per game numbers was pretty bad. Slightly behind him, although actually the one right behind him was Mikal Bridges. And that's not a surprise to see Poole, Jackson, and Bridges on this list. And Walker Kessler was actually next as well. These are all the guys who were top 50, top 40 players who ended up being stinking. The Curry and Halliburton ones will surprise you a little bit. But Poole, Halliburton, Jaren, and Kessler, not a surprise. And Bridges. The bottom two on this list are the points league busts. I use a similar methodology, but slightly different results. Jordan Poole still gets it, of course. Of course he does. 48 ADP, ranked 98th in per game for Yahoo points, so still snuck in the top 100. But the guy for totals that really killed you here, not for totals, the next worst guy in terms of, because we're not talking injuries, just per game production. I was actually pretty excited to get Markelle Fultz around the 100, 110 mark. He's going to be the Magic starting point guard. He will be able to get us some really good steals. He showed this big assist rate. His efficiency jumped up. I was really, when we talk about point guards drying up, getting him around that spot, I was really happy with. He was 95th. He went to 222nd. Bro, what? That's per game. That's not even including all of the time he missed with that nebulous knee soreness issue. He went from 95th per game to 222nd. Now, again, you pick him at pick 10, pick 9. It doesn't kill you that much. But he was unrosterable all year. And that was just not something that I saw coming. The last category that we're going to look at here is the breakout of the year. So how did I define this versus the waiver wire steal? These are the guys who were drafted everywhere, who improved the most on their value from the season prior. So who are the guys that actually stepped up? Now, some of them we could actually foresee. Some of us foresaw, some of us didn't foresee. So I'm only looking at categories here because for points it's literally exactly the same list. The biggest breakout guy was Scott Barnes, because Barnes in year 2, 22-23 season was not very good. He was 82nd in per game category -1 rankings. This season he became 25th. And the noticeable change in Toronto was the absence of Fred VanVleet and the changing coach from Darko Rajakovic, or from Nick Nurse to Darko Rajakovic. I thought that I didn't rate Barnes very highly. I had him higher than 82. I had him at 55 when I did my Raptors season preview. I did say that there was a real sleeper breakout potential here, but I don't necessarily see it. He also had a very weird season, Scott, where his first month to 6 weeks were unbelievable. He was tripling his block rate. He was 10 percentage points higher on all his efficiency numbers. He was averaging 4 or 5 rebounds extra per game. He was doing everything. He was putting up center numbers as a point guard. Ridiculous numbers. And he was running at top 10 for a long time. And then it all dropped away. The shooting went back to being bad. the block rate and rebounds, well, the rebounds sort of stuck and the block rate came down. Then RJ Barrett joined and that hurt him a lot. The usage took a big hit when Barrett was there. And then towards the end of the season, he was a slight sort of tick up for Barnes, but in the end, he ended up 25th. And I think if we actually went and broke down where the values were in terms of the ranking, he would start out like at 10, 9, and just keep getting worse and worse as the season went on. And I don't know where he ends up next season or what happens with any of that. He was clearly the big breakout guy, drafted everywhere. I had him in this like 58 or 60 zone around that area, and he easily beat that. I always find it hard, a little irresponsible to go in and say, well, this guy's playing all the same minutes, but he's actually just going to double his block rate and 1.5 his rebound rate. And now he's shooting going to be 10 percentage points better. Because how can you project that? Right? I find that hard to do because it's just not. That's like picking a name out of a hat and going, this guy's going to be good this year. Like it's very hard to do that. But Barnes was great. The opportunity, the usage increased for him, which again was easy to project, and we did that. He just upped all of his other stats, which is where a breakout comes from. Those true breakouts are guys that have usage going up, and then they just ramp up efficiencies and random things like block, steal, assist rate. And that's what Barnes did. He was a great breakout. Got it wrong completely. Tyrese Maxey was another pretty easy one. And at the start of the season, we didn't know whether James Harden was going to stay on this team, whether he was going to play for the team, what they were going to get back into trade for the team. In the end, he didn't play for the team. He was traded almost immediately, and they got nobody back who was useful. That's not true, but it is true. Because they got back Nick Batum, but no sort of usage player, no sort of star, nothing. So there were fears. Like, it was very easy to say, well, if Harden goes and nobody comes back, then we're all in on Maxey. And I was in on Maxey. I had him at like 40-ish. But it was hard to know, A, if Harden would play. For a lot of drafts, we just didn't know whether he would suit up or not. And B, what would come back and where would that push Maxey back into a smaller role? Much like it did 2 years ago when Maxey was the starter with Simmons out and then Harden came in and dropped Maxey's numbers way down. So Maxey was 87th last season. He went up to 27th this season. Again, like Barnes, started in the top 10 for the first month, 2 months of the season, gradually wore down as the season went on. His was a little bit different. Barnes was because Barrett arrived. Maxey's was mostly because Embiid was out. So he just had to take on more responsibility and his efficiency fell away. But he was still very clearly, very huge breakout that was relatively easy to see, even though we still undersold it. Daniel Gafford comes in third. This is the one that I was all over this one. The Wizards had no centers. Gafford was always a good per-minute producer. And while everyone, including me, called him the locker room legend because of a million locker room trips the year before, he actually played 77 games. He also started off the season really poorly, people wanting to drop him, but he exceeded all expectations. I had him at around 75, I'm going to say. He was 146 last season. He moved to 53rd this season. But there's also the problem with Gafford is that I had him on 4 out of my 6 redraft teams. I had drafted Daniel Gafford. And then he got traded to Dallas, and everything that Dallas said and all the actions they made was that he was not going to play much because they said he is our backup. They put him in as their backup. And for a month, he played 17 minutes a night and was 140th. And I go, well, if they're saying this and they're also doing this, I'm not sure that I want to hold on. And I ended up dropping him in a lot of those leagues. And then about 3 days later, he started. He played 27 minutes a night. They haven't lost a game since. He hasn't missed a shot since. Most of those are slight exaggerations, but only just. And he went back to being the same guy again. It is also a reminder that Daniel Gafford is not that good. He is a guy whose numbers translate to fantasy, who is almost definitely going to be overtaken by Derek Lively, maybe next season. I don't know. He is not that good, but the opportunity was there in Washington. It looked like it disappeared in Dallas. But then it came back, and he was great. So he's one of the biggest breakouts. And the last one is Jalen Duren, another obvious one, who is an interesting player. He was 131st last season. He played limited minutes because, Dwayne Casey and the Pistons. And then we thought it couldn't get worse, but it did, although we still at least got more out of Duren. We got a situation where he was able to play consistent 30, 31 minutes, sometimes 33, sometimes 29. Whereas the year before, you get like 22, 23. And you go, what are you doing? Why aren't you playing this man? Why are you starting James Wiseman and Marvin Bagley over him? What are you guys actually doing? So he was a very popular targeter in the 80s and 90s in drafts. He went from 131st up to 49th. I am still very, very concerned about Duran as a player. And that's more when we're looking to next season or future seasons in Dynasty. Because while his numbers all increased, the role was secure, I don't know, his defense is terrible. It's bad. He can't shoot. He's a good rebounder, but he's not a good defender. He doesn't challenge shots. He doesn't get a lot of blocks. He's got some passing flashes. He's still young, obviously. But as often happens, and I know the general consensus is the opposite of this, is that big men don't take longer to be better than guards. Big men usually produce immediately. If they're going to be good, they produce immediately. Most of the time. Not always. There's always going to be exceptions. But a general rule is the big men will produce early, especially in fantasy because it's not that hard to do. Rebound, field goal percentage, blocks. Just do that and your numbers are good. Walker Kessler last year, yeah? Guards, it's a lot harder. Field goal percentage takes the big hit. You struggle to have the ball in your hands enough, which you need as a guard, and you don't always have that as a rookie. So while Duran can still improve and can get better, his defensive stuff is a real concern, and I don't really know where this all goes. Still very young, youngest player in his draft class, younger than a bunch of rookies drafted this season, going to be younger than a lot of guys get drafted in the next draft. But I'm still a little worried. But he was one of the biggest breakouts. And that's your fantasy awards. I think most of those were relatively obvious. Just good to see some numbers there, I guess. And then we take all that to look when we get into next week, like just as a general holistic, who are the biggest busts and hits and misses and all that sort of stuff. But there are your fantasy awards for the 23-24 NBA season. If you want to give me a reward or an award, I'll just take one of your thumbs. Just drop that on the video, subscribe, double bang, ring the bell. And guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening. So much for a short show. See ya.